Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the Daily Friend Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, and today I am joined by Mr. Chris Hattingh. Chris, how you doing?
Afternoon, Nicholas. Sounds like there's another storm rolling into Johannesburg, so I'm just getting ready for some more power cuts this afternoon, and wet coal, of course.
Get excited, everyone. I also apologize if the sound of rain and lightning interrupts the show a bit, as I do have not the most substantial roof above my head, so it may sound a bit loud if it starts raining heavily. But anyway, we're also joined by Mr. Terence Corrigan. Terence, how are you, sir?
No, I understand that we're getting load shedding whether we get rain or not. So it's not a contingent; it's an absolute. Other than that, important things happening today. Eh?
Indeed, we have SONA this week on Thursday, I believe. That is, of course, the State of the Nation address, where President Ramaphosa will tell us a whole bunch of stuff, some of which will be enacted and a lot of which will remain on the drawing board. Which remains to be seen. But anyway, we will cover that when we get to it. In the meantime, though, let's start off with another development this week, which is a report into the July unrest, the riots that struck KZN and Gauteng. Terence, you've gone through the whole report. Can you give us some of your thoughts on the whole thing and maybe a little bit of a summary of its findings?
Well, I find what struck me first was the title, "Inquiry into Civil Unrest." Now, I'm old enough to remember this was the language that you used to hear on the 6 p.m. news in the 1980s. It seems the more things change, and all of that. As an account of what happened, we've. This is actually quite well trodden territory. This book that was written by a number of journalists, which appeared last year, gives an almost blow-by-blow account. So there's not a great deal that is new there. What struck me though was a few things. First of all, this was a panel appointed by President Ramaphosa. Point number one. The president himself his presence is suspiciously light in this report, or perhaps I should say noticeably light rather than suspiciously light, as it is in this book. And what I take away from that is that his presence over this period was not particularly significant. It's almost like he became a background figure, a kind of walk-on personality in the drama that was taking place. So as Minister of Police was a lot more visible, for instance. Which brings us to the next point. The report is absolutely damning of the intelligence agencies, very, very critical of the police response. It's fairly neutral on the conduct of the army. But it also minces no words that the executive has to take a large share of the role for basically having sat in its hands, having not made any preparations for this, for being caught completely flat-footed, and for having failed to provide any kind of coherent leadership. For instance, it mentions how there are different narratives being given by different ministers, which suggests that there wasn't even at that level the response was not being coordinated, and also different responses given, for instance, by the Commissioner of Police, the Minister of Police, local level commanders. Commissioner, as we know, I think chose to remain in headquarters. The Defense Force, I suppose, to their credit, were able to mobilize within 24 hours and bring equipment from across the country. Although there are points raised about the process for mobilizing them, particularly for an internal operation. And I think probably not a first, but I think something that will attract a lot of attention is that it also minces no words in pointing out just how widespread the concern about the impact of actions within the ANC are amongst South Africans, and how this has now become a danger to the stability of the state. And they say in their report towards the end, Mr. President, you asked us to determine whether the response of the security services was timeous, appropriate, and sufficient. The answer to that, in respect to the police and intelligence services, is an unequivocal no. Many reasons were proffered for this failure, but in the end, the response remains that they failed to do the necessary to protect life, limb, and property. The reasons are set out in the body of the report. The executive, however, carries some of the blame too, and must take responsibility for its lapse in leadership. And just coming off that, I think that our listeners could very fruitfully go to the Daily Maverick, a publication that has certain issues with us. We assure them that we love them. And read, I think it was a column by Feral Haffajee about 5 times that President Ramaphosa has put the ANC before the country, and this is one of them. And this report, I think, should cause a lot of the president's fan base to draw a very, very deep breath and wonder exactly whether there are grounds for retaining that faith. And as I say, this is a report that he himself commissioned, and it does not reflect well on the way he has overseen the country in one of its darkest moments post 1994.
So before I come to you, Chris, I just want to ask one more question, which is we had a little bit of internal debate on the show when the July riots happened as to how much of this was truly driven by kind of political actors seeking to cause chaos, and how much of this was maybe political actors starting something, but then it just snowballing because of the sort of socioeconomic conditions of the country. After reading the report, what's your sort of sense of how you feel about that question?
Look, I think that they probably that the report probably captures the situation as well as we can interpret it. Now, bear in mind that they point out the massive intelligence failures or whatever, so there's probably a lot happening that they were not able to divine. But it does seem that there was at least some coordination. There was some intent to cause chaos, but it definitely snowballed. They talk about how communities, communities, particularly poor communities and informal settlements close by to where looting was happening, were just turning out en masse. But that doesn't explain, for instance, deliberate efforts to block roads, for instance. There does seem to have been some level of coordination. The way it started in Gauteng, particularly in hostels, those there does appear to have been some element of coordination. But what they do point out is that it is a matter of, quote, disappointment that the supposed 12 ringleaders have not been arrested or identified. And the next paragraph, the report goes on to say, I don't think I'm misquoting here, if indeed these exist or something to that effect. So they say, well, this is what you claim. But where are they now? I think that perhaps it was coordinated, but probably in a more loose and incoherent fashion. And I think it's a bit like, stubbing out a stompy in the in a dry felt, after it's been blazing for days and days. Yes, there were factors that spurred it on. There were people who looked on with great satisfaction and who believed they could gain something beyond TV sets and bottles of cut flowers, which I saw one looter removing from a mall in Pietermaritzburg. But yes, there does appear, and the narrative here does seem to be that there was at least some sort of motivation, but that obviously doesn't explain the full circumstance. And they say, this will reoccur. I suppose when you have some political disaffection, a combination of disaffection, deprivation, and frustration, and you put those together, you don't really need a ringleader in a smoke-filled room. You need a couple of people with WhatsApps. We have the criminal gangs that are quite happy to take advantage of anything. We have desperate people that gains its own momentum.
So, Chris, you weren't with us when the July riots happened, but of course, I know you were observing them. So, I'd just like sort of your thoughts on them in general, because we haven't heard that before, but also any of these other issues you'd like to comment on. The president's response, the 12 ringleaders, this question of planned versus sort of circumstantial. What's your take on all these things?
Just before I started speaking, I had a very loud thunder strike here where I'm sitting. So I thought maybe that's a sign that I shouldn't talk. I don't know. Maybe what I'm about to say it should be struck from the record, as it were, even before it leaves my mouth. But let me go for it. And if I then keel over, then at least you'll know what the cause was. Look, in terms of that article by Haffergy, I thought that was interesting. And I think a better title might be 5 times Ramaphosa has put the party before the people and why he won't stop, because her article says why he has to stop. But I don't think that's necessarily going to stop this whole thing about a good and bad faction within the ANC. I don't think that's going to stop as such. Just on the riot specifically last year, I mean, given the country's trajectory, a lot of focus, of course, on state capture and the destruction that wrought, but not enough focus on the very ideas and policies of the ruling party and how much economic hardship that has caused. Not that it ever justifies looting and violence and that sort of thing, but just not being surprised that things like this would happen in a country with 47% unemployment. When the conditions for this sort of thing are around, then it shouldn't surprise any of us when it does eventually flare up, and when 1 or 12 or 24 actors decide to use it to their advantage for their own political grievances. I think the conditions exist for that sort of thing, and for as long as we're mired in lower economic freedom conditions, that will simply continue to be the case. So don't think these things are going to stop anytime soon. In terms of the report, I did want to ask Terence whether the report recommends a commission of inquiry be established, because I look forward to watching those public hearings and debates. And then just a final point, I suppose it points to President Ramaphosa's, again, sort of style, as it were, of trying to make sure all parties are heard, all parties are included, but then nothing actually gets done. So he's trying to keep all the disparate interests together and all that sort of thing. But given what this report says, and even though it seemed to be quite harsh, given he established sort of he requisitioned it, as it were, that it was quite damning in and of itself for a government report, I still don't think it's going to be acted upon. Maybe he's going to count it as one of the achievements of his administration and his SONA this week, that he asked for this report and look, it's been completed. Look, I'm trying to do something. But yeah, I just wanted to ask Terence, obviously.
Well, yeah, look. Okay, there's nothing that I can recall, and as I say, I have read the whole thing that calls for a commission of inquiry. There is, interestingly, a reference to the Marikana Commission and how, I think, as they say, more needs to be done to implement the recommendations. But as far as I know, that was one of those things that just stretched out endlessly until everyone got bored with it, and then could be filed underachieved, box ticked. The sort of shadow of Marikana does hang over this report. One of the things they do commend the police for is for not going crazy and shooting lots of people. Although they do say that crowd control, riot control, whatever you want, public order policing, in the 1980s, I think that was called the Internal Stability Unit, have not been are just not available. One little details: apparently there was only one water cannon in KwaZulu-Natal. So, and they brought in another one from elsewhere, but those resources just don't really exist. I mean, you can go back to to some of the reforms in the 1990s, which I think were fundamentally reasonable ones to try and build sort of community interfaces and to demilitarize policing. But the sort of clamor around crime, which the government denied was a problem for a long time, then went to the sort of other extreme. And Jackie Salebi did a great deal of damage, whether this was part of the plan from day one or not, in closing down many specialist units and I mean, I was told by one senior policeman from the time that he strode in and his solution to everything was have a roadblock. And said, well, roadblocks are not going to help drunken, disorderly conduct where people get shillelied with whiskey bottles and shebeens in the Northern Cape on a Saturday afternoon. No, roadblocks. I think that's the sort of thinking you have politicians taking on these roles that they're not that they do not have the professional experience for. In fact, the report does get into that and says that there's this confusion between political leadership and managerial responsibility. You have the minister barking orders, but he is not a policeman. I mean, he was the police commissioner, but incidentally, a former senior policeman who's now quite a prominent analyst said to me that actually, as far as police commissioners sort of post the Fivers era go, so they said he may well have been the best one.
Oh dear. I must say it is actually. I'm rather pleased that this wasn't a whitewash, at least not completely. Even if perhaps it doesn't put the president under quite enough scrutiny, considering that he is, the leader of the executive. But still, good that it was honest about the failures of the police and the intelligence services, and because although of course it would have been laughable if it had tried to sort of claim that, no, guys, it wasn't really that bad, you're all overreacting, because as we all saw, it was really that bad. Anyway, right, let us move on to our next story, and this is the continuing failure of our public protector to win any court battles. She has lost an enormous number of court battles since being appointed, the most recent of which was regarding her report into Helen Zille's colonialism tweet. So the public protector released a report in June of 2018, which said that Helen Zille's tweets about utilizing the benefits of colonial legacy in order to, create the modern country, were likely to cause racial tensions, division, and violence in South Africa, and that her conduct was in violation of the sections of the Executive Ethics Code. Zille then, of course, argued with this in very strong terms. She approached the High Court in Pretoria to review and set aside the findings of the report, but the court declined to review the decision. She then went to the Supreme Court of Appeal. There was no opposition from the public protector, and in the end, the Supreme Court of Appeal found that the public protector had basically made a mistake and set the thing aside. So, looks like another win for Zille with regards to this issue. She has talked about it at length, I think. But Chris, let me start with you. Any thoughts on the public protector's record of losing court battles, and also of the surprisingly long legacy of a couple of tweets about how Singapore had managed to, develop itself from a poor country?
I suppose it's quite prescient around the legacy of the content of the tweets when one is struggling to make sense of things going on around one, the country, the hardships. Then maybe when someone puts out a bit of a different take on it, it gets a bit more mileage than saying, for example, we're going to have another 100 million rand job creation summit, and this time it'll work, as opposed to actually looking at some other causes and factors going into a country's current state of affairs. So I suppose it's quite noteworthy and a credit to Ms. Zille with some of her analysis and commentary, how these tweets and the content thereof have kept going for a while. On the public protector, again, one wonders, one almost wonders whether there was any pressure around this whole saga, whether there's something else going on in the background in terms of wanting to get a win here, quote unquote, with the tweets maybe looking like the public protector is active and taking a role and all this sort of stuff, when meanwhile, maybe it wasn't really actually based on sound constitutional grounds, rule of law grounds, any of that sort of thing. That's why it's now been set aside. So yeah, another notch on the post. Maybe that's what the public protector was going for, a record number of failed cases. I'm not sure what the total failure is, what the best is by any particular public protector, but maybe the current one is trying to get to that point.
Terence, your thoughts on this issue?
Well, yeah, I was always a bit bewildered about her decision, and no matter how enraged the what 5% of the population that has access to Twitter may have been about this, and however wildly it may have been denounced on this Eusebius McKaiser show, I don't really think this was actually something of huge concern to most South Africans. Look, I think Zil in a way is, one of those acquired tastes, one of those like binary tastes. You love her or you hate her. And I think that those people had made their decisions long before she did that. But I do think though that what struck me at the time was just how bizarre this all seemed to be, because what she said was hardly new or controversial. I'd just like to read something that was said a couple of years ago. Much of our traditional systems and institutions still carry the scars of the distortions inflicted by colonial rule. At the same time, so much of what we have to build on in the competitive modern world is also the result of what we could gain from that interaction and engagement with Britain. Talking very clearly about being colonized. In fact, the preceding paragraph talks about Britain being the premier colonizing power. That was Nelson Mandela. So, I'm sure that we would find few people coming onto the Daily Friend show who would defend the record of the Soviet Union. But you might also say, well, the communists sort of did develop it from an agrarian into an industrial economy at an enormous cost and very inefficiently and whatever. But a win's a win. Fidel Castro may have outlived his welcome after his 47-year term as Cuba's president, but the Cubans have a decent healthcare system. Yes, colonialism left some roads and stuff and some ideas. I think that it says a lot more about the standard of public debate than it does about anything that she believes. So yes,
indeed. I think for me the thing about the public protectors after Thuli Madonsela sort of became an enemy of Zuma's government, even though, in my opinion, she actually was pretty soft on, for example, the whole Nkandla thing. But anyway, I think
if you want a hot take on Helen Zille, she's repeatedly said Jacob Zuma was the most charming man she ever met. So
I think she's probably right, actually. We did a whole podcast special a while ago, back when Zuma got arrested, about how he could have used his powers for good.
What a nice scoundrel he was.
But be that as it may, I think after Thuli Madonsela caused problems, a decision may have been made in government that never again would anyone who had anything except the party's best interests at heart be appointed public protector, and I suspect that may have been what happened. Anyway, let's move on to our last story, and this is quite a sad one, but I think it illustrates, it's a very practical illustration of a lot of the stuff we complain about. We're always talking about the costs of South Africa's bad economic policy and how this hurts things and how this causes businesses to be snubbed out. And this regards a story from businessinsider.co.za, where they looked into a smartphone factory which was opened to great fanfare in South Africa, the Mara smartphone factory, which was launched in 2019 with a 1.5 billion rand investment. This was the opening was attended by President Cyril Ramaphosa, who said that, quote, this is just outside Durban. This was a great moment in South Africa's drive to be a producer of advanced goods. However, in the year 2022, the factory is now empty and on auction. Basically everything is being sold off, including the office furniture. The business seems to have gone completely bust. And when Business Insider asked the company and some of the investors, including Standard Bank, what had been shut down, what was going on, there was pretty much no response. So I think a sad day, because it's always good to see one's economy flourishing, but fairly predictable, I suspect, because of our economic conditions. Chris, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, one can try and draw links to other factories that have also closed down and are moving. I mean, Clover stands out as one particular example in Northwest, just around local municipalities not delivering services that are supposed to be, that taxpayers pay for, and then when those services fail, then businesses have to take on extra costs on their own. For example, generators, extra security in KZN, Gauteng with the riots again, so adding the cost. So that could have definitely been a factor, but just another one could simply be market forces, as eerie and creepy as that might be to think about, how people might just not have wanted these locally produced smartphones. I mean, I guess another blow to the localization master plans, because apparently if you can just stimulate local goods, then people will automatically buy them. But I think South Africans generally have access to a wide range of pretty affordable smartphones, including from well-established Chinese manufacturers such as Xiaomi, Vivo, and Huawei. So it could also be that the factory and the output was simply unsustainable, and given that maybe the people sort of trying to run it, and now they're going to pivot maybe to other locally produced goods, or they're just going to try and leverage off trying to maybe get those Chinese manufacturers to take over part of the factory so that they cover some of the costs. So it could be obviously partly the policies and the municipal failures, but also just simple market forces and supply and demand, meaning that their smartphones aren't as in demand as they hoped they would be.
Right. I think what I'm really taking away from what you're saying here is that we in a very competitive world, and you have to play to win, and that means that you need to have something that means that your factories are going to stick around, and not just to help your factories so that they stick around and don't go bust, i.e. they mustn't be taxed to death, have terrible labor regulations, etc., etc. Terence, your thoughts?
Well, I actually wrote a piece about this when it was open, saying that this was a good thing and we needed much more of this. And I suspect what happened was that the bottom just fell out of South Africa's economy over COVID, and this was a big investment in what was to some extent an untested product. In that the brand probably wasn't very familiar. I also have a vague memory of reading at the time that it was significantly more expensive than many of the imported alternatives. This is there is kind of no guarantee. There is no magic wand you can wave. South Africa has a lot of very deep structural problems, which have been added to year by year by chronic misgovernance. The bring your own infrastructure phenomenon. They invest in South Africa. All you need is a power station, a water supply, and you're sort of set. But things that we should I think be taking a lot more advantage of our proximity to African markets that are growing, even though unevenly. I understand that Mara has another facility in Rwanda, and I would love to know how that's doing, because that seems to be what Rwanda is aiming at. Now, yes, before anyone attacks me in the comments about not knowing anything about Rwanda, I am well aware that there are significant debates about whether Rwanda is not cooking its own books or whatever. Point is that I think that there are opportunities for South Africa, but they are not the opportunities that our planning diktat office seems intent on applying. And I imagine that if there are some good journalists in this country, someone needs to get the smartphone number of the investor, whose name I forget, but I think his office is in Dubai. Phone him up and ask him, why is this no longer producing? Maybe get an answer, and he might, actually take that as an experience and learn from it.
Precisely. Anyway, that's all the time we have for today. If you enjoy our content, please like this video, leave us good reviews on the podcast apps if you're listening to us on audio only, and subscribe to our channel. And also, if you really enjoyed it, please share it. Or even if you think that we're idiots, share it. In fact, just generally share it. With that said, thank you very much, and we'll see you tomorrow on the Daily Friends Show. Cheers, everyone.